Okay, I think we're good to go. So welcome back everyone to our workshop on the possibility and the impossibility of reparations for slavery and colonialism. And thank you once again to Kay Zhang and Tess Chaliford-Draman for all your help. And to all of you participants and audience for your patience and continued interest. The strike is officially over at Columbia, and we are now voting on whether or not to accept a proposed union contract. We are excited to be back today with the panel entitled Colonial Reckoning. Today's discussant is Laura Beanie Carter. She is a PhD candidate in anthropology at the CUNY Graduate Center. After long periods of life and work in Martinique, the Dominican Republic, Haiti, and New York City, she undertook dissertation fieldwork both in Guadeloupe and with the diasporic French Antillean communities in Paris and its banlieue. She studies subaltern expressive cultural practices, music, dance, storytelling, carnival. Her dissertation's focus is on diverse forms of cultural politics generated within the French Antillean post-colonial that testify both to the persistence of race and class-based inequalities on the one hand, and to creative resistance through artistic production and race and social mobilization on the other. So thank you so much, Laura, for coming today, and I will hand over to you.
Okay, great. I want to thank everyone in the organizing and administrative side of this, especially thank you to the main organizers, Howie and Anna, and as well as Kay, for the technical help and skills that are priceless. I think that all of us are have to be grateful for the efforts they have made to keep it going, and I think it's really the persistence of these efforts are very much in tune with the pressing need to discuss this question of reparations and repair. So without further ado, I'm actually just going to introduce the speakers, and then hopefully their fruitful discussions will push us to ask questions. So I will be giving you guys and your questions space and time to develop on these ideas after the three presentations. So without further ado, the three presenters today are Cressa Pugh, Lindsey Buten, Rosaline Armange. So Cressa is a PhD candidate in sociology and social policy at Harvard. Her research examines the social legacies of imperialism in post-colonial Africa and Southeast Asia, cultural heritage and museums, and violence. Her dissertation project examines artifacts looted from the Benin Kingdom by British forces that are now housed in Western museums, and asks how debates about these objects may help us understand and grapple with the social and political legacies of imperialism. Her research fundamentally examines narratives of restitution and repair, and the ways in which healing and the reclamation of memory and communal historiographies materialize in the post-colonial context. A native of Nashville, Tennessee, she holds a BA in anthropology and religion from Bates College and a master's in migration studies from the University of Oxford. Thank you, Cressa, for being here today. Our second presenter today will be Lindsey Buten. She's an assistant professor of communication studies at McMaster University in Hamilton, Ontario. Her research focuses on the racial politics of communication, on social justice and the relationship among public and collective memory of slavery and demands for reparation and redress. Her current book project explores how campaigns against human trafficking reproduce anti-Blackness in the name of ending so-called modern-day slavery. She earned her PhD in communications from the University of Pennsylvania and was a pre-doctoral fellow at the Carter G. Woodson Institute for African American and African Studies at the University of Virginia. Our third and final speaker today will be Rosaline Armange. She's a clinical health psychologist by training who earned her doctorate in cognitive psychology at École pratique des hautes études in Paris. She was the 2018-2019 Du Bois Mandela Rodney postdoctoral fellow at the University of Michigan and will be a summer fellow at the School of Criticism and Theory at Cornell. Her interdisciplinary scholarship exploits the intersection of politics, race, ethnicity, gender, literature, philosophy, and psychology. She integrates critical perspectives on culturality, Blackness, ADOS, and decoloniality into theoretical and empirical research in moral cognition, social psychology, and political psychology. Her current book project, Slavery Reparations in the Americas, an argument for racial terminology, argues for creating a legal culture that integrates African descent as an operating term to challenge Western policymaking on reparatory justice. Thank you to Rosalind also.
All right, so this is Krisa. Thank you so much, Lara, for that introduction, and also for being our panel discussion and reading all of our papers and giving great feedback. Also want to thank Anna and Howie for organizing this wonderful event. I know it's taken a lot of effort and energy over the past couple of years to pull this together. So thank you for the perseverance in doing so. The title of my talk today is The Afterlife of Cultural Death. And the paper that I'm presenting today is an excerpt from my dissertation that I'm currently writing, which examines the debates about colonial era looted indigenous artifacts that are now on display in Western museums. And it attempts to repatriate them and to their places of origin. So this paper is very much a work in progress. So I'm open to all types of feedback and really look forward to an engaging discussion. So in 2007, the Musée du Quai Branly, which is France's state ethnological museum, held an exhibition of royal art from the Edo Kingdom of Benin. The vast majority of the objects contained in this exhibition were plundered from the Benin Kingdom during a British invasion in 1897, which resulted in the capture and colonization of this region, which is now modern-day Nigeria. Sylvester Obechi, who's a professor of art at the University of California and who descends from ancient Benin clan and who identifies as ethnically Edo, attended this 2007 exhibition because he had never seen firsthand the cultural antiquities from his ancestral homeland. In an interview, Ogbechi recounted the moment he first laid eyes on a sword, which you see pictured to the right, of the last king of Benin, which is an object of great cultural significance to the Edo people. Ogbechi recalled that upon seeing the sword in the museum, he instinctively began performing the traditional salute to Benin kings, which entailed dropping down on one knee and crossing his hands in front of his chest with his palms flat out. The museum goers around him, who were mostly white, were notably startled to see someone performing such a ritual in a Parisian museum. Yet for Ogbechi, this performance was a necessary act of restoring a sense of kinship between he and his Benin clan, and honoring the spirit of his ancestors that was embedded in the sword itself. Since an estimated 4,000 to 10,000 artifacts were looted from Benin in 1897, very few Edo people have seen them in person, save for a handful of privileged individuals who have the financial, geopolitical, and cultural capital to travel to the West to see them in museums. What this means is that the majority of people from Benin, which remains a living and vibrant culture, have long been alienated from their material heritage. These objects are significant to the Edo for many reasons. First, many of the objects which were created in the 13th century before Benin had a written history bear a pictorial representation of Benin's major historical events and royal proceedings. So these objects serve as the only remaining archive of Benin's ancient history. Second, these are not just historical objects, but they're believed by many to be the living embodiment of the kingdom's ancestors themselves. As Benin scholar Frida Hai has noted, the dialogic relationship is not only physical, but also spiritual. The artworks, apart from serving as records of events and the worldview of the people, also served as objects of communication with the ancestors. These objects embodied the souls of Benin's lineage, and their forcible removal and relocation to Western museums has decontextualized their inherent and intended meaning, thus rendering them and their current location culturally and spiritually bankrupt. So in this paper, I used the case of the Benin bronzes to examine notions of social and cultural alienation, seizure, disruption, expulsion, bondage, and slavery, and used recent debates about heritage restitution to think through the possibilities of repair, reparations, reclamation, and redemption. I employ Orlando Patterson's theory of social death to argue that both the people and the objects that are alienated from one another during the looting of artifacts experience a process of social and cultural death. I then build on and extend this theory by arguing that restitution, or the return of plundered objects to their source communities, is a form of reparations that offers the opportunity for spiritual redemption from the state of cultural death. My goal is to establish a conceptualization of cultural regeneration that, via restitution and reparations more broadly, provides a pathway out of symbolic death toward emancipation. In 1982, sociologist Orlando Patterson penned Slavery and Social Death, which was a landmark text which examined the origins and relations within the institution of slavery through a survey of ancient and contemporary global societies, which span millennia. Fundamental to Patterson's thesis is the concept of social death. The slave, he argued, was a socially dead individual alienated from all rights and claims of birth, and who ceased to belong to any legitimate social order. The slave, in Patterson's words, was a genealogical isolate, or one who was natally alienated through separation from his parents, blood relation, remote ancestors, and even his descendants. In effect, a loss of ties at birth with respect to both ascending and descending generations. According to Patterson, the slave experienced pure forced alienation from his history. Quote, formally isolated in his social relations with those who lived, he was also culturally isolated from the social heritage of his ancestors. He had a past, to be sure, but a past is not a heritage, end quote. Social death and the process of social negation, to Patterson, was the first phase of the process of enslavement, given that it entailed violently uprooting the individual from their community and subsequently desocializing and depersonalizing them. Embedded in this process was the institutionalization of marginality, which was the ultimate cultural outcome of the loss of natality, honor, and power. According to Peter Suzuki, speaking on the Nias of Indonesia, quote, slaves are not mentioned in any ancestral myth, have no place in the world tree, thus lack religion and consequently a place in the cosmos. They have no past nor future, living as they do, on the whims and mercy of their masters. They live on the fringes of the cosmos and are viewed as being almost on par with animals, end quote. My argument in this paper is that the people of Benin and the Benin artifacts and their forcible removal and relocation to Western museums have experienced a form of cultural alienation leading to what I refer to as cultural death. Like social death, cultural death is the result of violent rupture of a people, not only from their material heritage, but also from the stories, narratives, histories, and people embedded in the objects. The sitting king of Benin has described the stolen objects as pages torn off from the book of a people's life history. And he's argued that the removal of these works, described as, quote, records of our souls, have led to a fragmented experience. There appears to be some form of collective amnesia as a result of the gap created by the loss of these works. Thus, cultural death is an autobiographical void left unfilled by decades and centuries of colonial extraction and violence. As I noted earlier, these antiquities are not just historical or symbolic objects, but are embodiments of royal ancestors and means through which their spirit and guardianship is kept alive for the people of Benin today. The language used to describe the looting and retention of the artifacts in Western museums draws directly on references to slavery and suggests that some consider the objects themselves and their new environments akin to enslaved persons. Peju Leiwola, a Benin scholar and artist, has argued that Western museums hold African art objects literally in bondage. In her discussion of the ancestral legacies of the objects, Leiwola notes, quote, they who once enjoyed the splendor of the palace are now trapped behind glass walls in foreign lands. These diasporic ancestors seem to keep yelling, unbind us, end quote. In response to Leiwola, another Benin artist noted, that statement in itself invokes memory, reflection, pain, and irony. referencing the destructive effect of the looting and desacralization of ancestor forms and allusion to the impact of cultural loss on the memory of Benin legacies. The artifacts scattered across the Western world and museums, art galleries, and auction houses in communities far flung from Benin have thus become members of the Benin diaspora and their isolation and alienation from their homeland. The cultural imperialism of looting and the retention of artifacts in the West ensures a sense of cultural death that leaves a community ill-equipped to write its own history, tell its own story, and confer such narratives to future generations, thereby ensuring future iterations of cultural death. The crux of Patterson's argument is that the state of social death is enduring, following a slave for their lifetime and for generations to come. Claude Meillassoux, who has elaborated upon Patterson's theory of social death, notes, quote, "The captive always appears, therefore, as marked by an original, indelible defect, which weighs endlessly upon his destiny. This is a kind of social death. He can never be brought to life again as such, since, in spite of some specious examples of fictive rebirth, the slave will remain forever an unborn being," end quote. Yet in this paper, I'd like to challenge this assertion that social death in its cultural form is a perpetual condition by arguing that reparations, and in the case of the Benin artifacts, restitution in particular, may provide a pathway toward redemption from cultural death. A decade after Slavery and Social Death was published, Patterson wrote a 2-volume text entitled Freedom, which assesses the origins of freedom as a universal value and the ways in which it is implicitly linked to the institution of slavery. Yet, there remains a sense that within societies, ancient to contemporary, there are groups who are free and there are groups who are condemned to social death, but there's little discussion of a person or community who has experienced social death being redeemed, reborn, or becoming free. Thus, I argue that reparations are one manifestation of the afterlife of social death, and restitution manifests as the afterlife of cultural death. If the plunder of the cultural artifacts plunged the Benin community into a state of cultural death, then it follows that the return of such objects might facilitate a turn toward cultural redemption. Since Nigeria gained its independence in 1960, the people of Benin and the government of Nigeria have sought the return of the heritage from their museums, but have largely had little success. Museums generally argue that the objects are safer in their museums in the West, that they have a commitment and mandate to educate global citizens and can do that better than museums in the global South, and their institutions provide necessary context for understanding the intersections of and relations between the world's historic civilizations. Restitution advocates, on the other hand, argue that restitution is a necessary step towards starting to acknowledge and undo the historical and continuing injustices rooted in imperial hegemony and violence. In 1996, British Labour MP Bernie Grant waged a nationwide campaign for reparations, an aspect of which focused on the restitution of the Benin bronzes. During the campaign, he and his colleagues argued that the return of the Benin artifacts would be a, quote, gesture of a historic reconciliation and a positive response to the age-long yearnings and aspirations of an aggrieved people, and would allow the nation to redress the balance of power and open up the possibility of a new and more appropriate relationship between people who have had a long history of contact, end quote. The looting of Benin's heritage and African heritage more generally exacerbated a sense of mistrust rooted in paternalism that has long existed between the West and Africa. And as such, a return of the heritage would go a long way toward the restoration of these relations. As Peju Leiwola has noted, quote, "The collective memories of various African peoples are still alive with the recollections of the oppressive colonial and slave periods. Reparation of cultural artifacts is not simply the return of goods, but the beginning of a healing process for both the victors and the defeated, for the aggressors and the victims," end quote. The return of Benin's artifacts have the potential to provide the nation with an opportunity to forge their own history and historical narratives that for more than a century, have been told by colonizers and enslavers. Benin must be granted the opportunity to reconcile its colonial past heal its historic wounds, and seek redemption from the cultural death it experienced in 1897 and continues to experience today while their artifacts sit in Western galleries. The history of a people whose legacies have been erased and appropriated in Western cultural institutions can only be restored through the return of their heritage. The contemporary generation must seek to repair such legacies so that future generations have access to resources that would allow them to narrate their own history. In conclusion, while the looting of Benin's heritage was a significant event in the history of the nation and has had substantial implications for the living culture, the form of cultural death that I speak of was not totalizing. And the work of contemporary artists and the longevity and persistence of Benin's thriving artistic and cultural spaces is a testament to the endurance of the nation's cultural legacies. And indeed, change in the form of restitution is on the horizon. In late 2020, the government of Nigeria and the royal family of Benin announced plans to construct a new museum at the palace in Benin City that will, among other features, serve as a repository for repatriated Benin bronzes in anticipation of successful negotiations with European partners. And just a few weeks ago, Germany's State Ethnological Museum and the Humboldt Forum, as well as the Horniman Museum in London, announced plans to begin the process of repatriation of their Benin collections. But given that an estimated 90% of Africa's material cultural heritage is held outside of the continent, there's still much work to be done toward securing justice for these stolen ancestors. But these movements suggest that there is hope yet for redeeming the communities and their artifacts from cultural death. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Cressa, for that. Can everyone hear me? Can you hear me? Great. As an anthropologist, I'm just curious, basically for the, I guess the gritty kind of field work, who are your interlocutors, methods question. I know it's kind of annoying sometimes, but I'm wondering who you're in dialogue with, because it's really interesting. And this concept of cultural death, I just wanted to push you on it so that you give us some of the meat of those engagements that you have with these folks, and so that I can kind of understand the progress of the development of this concept of cultural death and what you foresee as coming to fruition, and in what forms.
Yeah, that's a great question. Thanks, Sara. So I am speaking to the archive right now just because this was supposed to be my research year. And given the pandemic, I wasn't able to spend as much time. I was only able to spend about 2 months in Nigeria before I had to come back due to the pandemic. So currently I had in previous years done archival research in the UK and in Nigeria. So particularly looking at the archives in the British Museum, at the National Archives of the UK, the National Museum of Nigeria, and the State Archives in Nigeria. And I've been mainly looking at the papers so I mentioned briefly toward the end of my presentation, Bernie Grant, who was an MP from the 70s to the 90s in the UK. And his collection of papers is in London. And he had an organization called the Africa Reparations Movement. And so I've been looking at a lot of those papers. But my goal really is to kind of get out of the archives as soon as the pandemic is over, inshallah, and actually go back to Nigeria and spend some more time in Benin City. So I'd spent about a month in Benin City and a month in Lagos, and Benin City is still where these objects are being produced. And so I had, over the course of a month, been in conversation with some of the contemporary artists, contemporary bronze makers, some collectors, some art collectors. I met with a couple of the museum professionals at both Benin Museum and the National Museum in Lagos. And so those are my interlocutors. And also just, I was interested in talking to just everyday people in Nigeria just to see what they thought about this. You know, I talked to my Uber drivers. I talked to, folks who are working in the hotels that I was staying in. I was talking to just people that or like walked up to me in markets and were asking me what I was doing. And then I would tell them what I was doing and then ask them what they thought about what I was doing. And so, I really hope that, hopefully maybe as early as this fall, I'll be able to go back and continue to have those conversations. But yeah, thanks for that question.
Sure, I hope so too. We all hope to be back in the field. So the next speaker, I guess Lindsey?
Yes.
Oh, sorry.
That's okay. I'm going to share my screen. Okay, thank you everyone so much for being here and for having me. I'm especially grateful to Beanie for engaging with our work, and to Howie and Anna for your exceptional persistence and coordination during many different iterations of this program. So today I'm going to share with you a few examples, an excerpt from a chapter that is part of a larger book project. The book is called Trafficking in Anti-Blackness, and it's still in progress. So I'm looking forward to any feedback and suggestions. So the chapter comes from my larger project that analyzes the racial logics of campaigns to end human trafficking. I argue that the anti-trafficking apparatus, which is the constellation of NGOs, governments, policies that are trying to end human trafficking, that group of actors uses the term modern day slavery and associated rhetoric and imagery specifically to circumvent Western historical responsibility for slavery. In the process of doing so, it creates a parade of characters and slogans that imply Black demands for redress and racial justice in the present are illegitimate. So I'm arguing that the development of anti-trafficking as an international policy issue is actually directly tied to eliding movements for reparations for slavery. And more generally, that the phrase modern day slavery as it relates to human trafficking works to produce a historically innocent white subject in the face of demands for redress in the present. So in the chapter that I'm talking about today, I trace how the discursive contours of anti-trafficking took shape amid widespread international and US-based organizing for reparations for slavery in the 1990s and early 2000s. So narrating reparations history as part of the political context anti-trafficking initiatives sought to contest reveals how central the specific language of slavery and the concept of white innocence was to the formation of anti-trafficking as a discourse and policy. So in tracing this history that has been, a bit under-examined by critical anti-trafficking scholars who have otherwise done an excellent job of pointing out the many limits of the criminalizing emphasis in anti-trafficking policy, we can see how using the term modern day slavery to define human trafficking was not just sensationalizing or sloganeering, but actually a key vehicle for establishing the anti-trafficking agenda as a politically palatable alternative to reparations movements that international states could get on board with. So let's look at a few examples. The first comes from the BBC. So I'm going to compare a moment in 1999, which was right before anti-trafficking entered the kind of mainstream transnational policy stage, and a moment in 2015 when anti-trafficking discourse and policy was by that time very widespread and popular. So in 1999, the headline, "Trillions Demanded in Slavery Reparations," appeared in the BBC. During the first international meeting of the African World Reparations and Repatriation Truth Commission held in Accra, Ghana, delegates issued a demand for $777 trillion to be repaid to African countries from Western Europe and the United States. The news article that covers the demand explains how the Accra Declaration's figure was calculated and discusses the declaration's additional demands around debt forgiveness. The piece ends quite jarringly, though, with the sentence, "Contrary to widespread belief, slavery is still practiced in some parts of Africa, including Sudan and West Africa." The concluding sentence, dramatic departure from the content of the rest of the article, raises the question, what is the relevance of this sentence to the demand for reparations? In the article's adjacent relevant stories sidebar, 2 other news articles report on West Africa's so-called child slave trade, which refers to contemporary trafficking of children for domestic labor, and to the, quote, ancient practice of slavery that supposedly continues in Sudan. So read together, these August 1999 articles conflate the language of trafficking and slavery in order to suggest, if slavery still exists in Africa, why should the West pay reparations? So 16 years after the Accra Declaration in 2015, UK Prime Minister David Cameron was publicly pressed to address the issue of paying reparations for slavery to Jamaica during a trade relations diplomatic visit. Cameron dismissed CARICOM's demands by stating via spokesperson, quote, "The UK government abhorred slavery and indeed had passed the Modern Slavery Act to tackle human trafficking today." So in this convergence, we see the longstanding specter of slavery in Africa being deployed in 1999, which is before anti-trafficking policy was highly popularized. And in that case, it was used to counter blame and responsibility for transatlantic slavery. But then by 2015, once anti-trafficking has fully saturated transnational governance structures, the term modern slavery is used as a complete bait and switch for reparations demands. Okay, so let's look at another example where reparations demands meets anti-trafficking policies that were created by the US Department of State. This time it's in the context of the 2001 World Conference on Racism, the WCAR. So in May 2001, the US Department of State, then led by Colin Powell, stated that it would not support international compensatory measures for slavery and the slave trade of the, quote, distant past. This was in response to reports that reparations for slavery would be on the agenda at the UN World Conference Against Racism. A day after the conference ended, Condoleezza Rice told the press, quote, "Given the fact that there's plenty of blame to go around for slavery, plenty of blame to go around among African and Arab states, plenty of blame to go around among Western states, I think we're better to look forward, not pointing fingers backward," end quote. Colin Powell and Condoleezza Rice, serving in the roles of US Secretary of State, also oversaw the global anti-trafficking enforcement under Republican President George W. Bush from 2001 to 2009. So less than a year after they had led the US effort to undermine advocacy for reparations for slavery at the WCIR, Powell released the 2002 Trafficking in Persons report, which is known as the TIP report, where he condemned, quote, trafficking as a modern form of slavery. So here you see the rhetorical setup, right? There's no responsibility for slavery of the distant past. It's better to turn our attention to contemporary slavery. That's the rhetoric that's being set up. Powell declared, quote, "The resolve of the entire US government to stop this appalling assault on the dignity of men, women, and children," referring to trafficking. In 2003, Powell expressed his commitment to end modern slavery and support the US efforts to end trafficking in persons, to protect and help victims, and prosecute those who treat people like commodities or keep them in slave-like conditions. By 2007, Condoleezza Rice, then Secretary of State, introduced the TIP report stating, quote, 200 years ago, the British Parliament outlawed the transatlantic slave trade. culminating a decades-long struggle led by William Wilberforce. Trafficking in persons is a modern-day form of slavery, a new type of global slave trade. She goes on, as in the 19th century, committed abolitionists around the world have come together in a global movement to confront this repulsive crime, end quote. So if in 2001, Powell and Rice didn't want the world telling the US how to handle its racial past and present as it related to reparations for slavery, they had since found anti-trafficking advocacy a politically palatable way to engage in slavery talk and address the nation's history, but by emphasizing a whitewashed abolitionist past. According to Rice, although the US and the West are not exceptionally to blame for the transatlantic slave trade because African and Arab states also played a role, a single man is exceptionally honored, William Wilberforce, for ending the global system. Slavery is in the distant past of the West for Powell. Abolitionist sentiment is deemed much more representative of the US government's history and present. If, according to the final WCIR declaration language, slavery and the transatlantic slave trade should have been a crime against humanity, but were not, modern slavery is now a contemporary, quote, repulsive crime, in Rice's words, that will be prosecuted to the furthest extent of the law, in Powell's words. So here you see a politically palatable way to deal with problems of unsafe migration and the uneven distribution of resources, which are themselves legacies of transatlantic slavery and colonialism, not with reparations and redistribution, but with criminalization to prosecute so-called modern enslavers of their own people. This rhetorical project then calls criminalization abolition. It calls Africans enslavers of their own people. And doing so relates to the long-standing racist trope and reparations dodge, the idea of slavery in Africa, what Ibrahim Sundiata calls the slaver's canard. Okay, so now I want to transition to some historical precedents in the early 1900s that follow similar rhetorical patterns so we can trace how slavery in Africa and white slavery discourses come to get traction. So nearly 100 years before the US Trafficking Victims Protection Act was first passed in 2000, discourses of slavery in Africa and white slavery were similarly used by former slaving nations to undermine Black sovereignty and racial justice initiatives in the case of independent African nations in the League of Nations and anti-lynching campaigns in the US, respectively. So in the chapter, I discuss how the trope of slavery within Africa has been a recurring mode of transnational politics that is used to invite and justify former slaving and colonizing states to intervene in African countries. So of course, we think of the scramble for Africa in the 1880s and 90s, but also in how the League of Nations adjudicated the membership of Ethiopia and Liberia. And here I'm building on Adem Getachu's work, where she talks about former slaving nations, meaning Europe and the US, used the figure of slavery in Africa to position themselves as humanitarian abolitionists and to position independent African nations as incapable of self-governance without European imperial presence. And this was all in the early 20th century. In this same period in the US, progressive reformers were panicking over the so-called white slave trade, which feminist scholars have noted addressed many social anxieties in the time and bears a strong resemblance to the way anti-trafficking discourse and policy is oriented in the early 2000s. So in the chapter, I read the white slave panic in the context of anti-lynching campaigns led by Ida B. Wells Barnett to demonstrate how, once again, white slavery discourses were used to undermine organizing for racial justice by replacing the realities of racial violence, the legacies of slavery, and the system of white supremacy that underpin it with a new white slavery with urgent claims to end the exploitation of white women in the 1910s. So we see how modern day slavery, white slavery, and slavery in Africa have been used historically to undermine Black self-determination and racial justice-based anti-lynching campaigns, and now recur in contemporary anti-trafficking campaigns as well. And I want to just briefly tie this to another contemporary usage of white slavery, and that's the Irish slavery meme, and how it's used in relation to calls for reparations today. So you might remember back in September 2016, when the UN Working Group of Experts on People of African Descent released a report saying that the US owed reparations to African Americans. In the same month that the US News covered that report, scholar Liam Hogan uncovered that Google searches for the term Irish slaves hit an all-time high. So Hogan's research investigates the increased circulation of Irish slavery memes amid the rise of the Black Lives Matter movement. He writes that white nationalists use Irish slavery memes to mock African-American calls for slavery by stating, quote, "My Irish ancestors were the first slaves in America. Where are my reparations?" So we have here two competing uses of white slavery discourses in the present that both undermine reparations organizing. One comes from anti-trafficking reformers that often portray bound white hands in rope and young women as enslaved in prostitution. And one from avowed white nationalists that uses white slavery, here Irish slavery, to troll BLM posts. While we may be tempted to think of anti-trafficking as well-intentioned but misguided, both uses converge in the state and racial logics reiterated by Condoleezza Rice, that if everyone is complicit in slavery, no one is exceptionally responsible. And if many types of people have been enslaved in the past and in the present, then Black Americans are not exceptionally entitled to reparations. So just to briefly tie this all together, anti-trafficking's key tropes, slavery in Africa, white slavery, and modern day slavery, are used by advocates to circumvent Western historical responsibility for slavery amid calls to hold former slaving nations to account. These discursive figures are not new. Slavery in Africa and white slavery were also used in the progressive era to undermine Black African sovereignty and US racial justice campaigns. Both have been used in the 2000s to dismiss claims for reparations by the US State Department during the WCIR and by self-described white nationalists in the wake of the Black Lives Matter protests. Anti-trafficking reintroduces these discursive formations, slavery in Africa and white slavery, within the political context of organizing for reparations in the late 1990s, revealing how its specific terms do political work to undermine movements for Black freedom and for Black futures, despite its constant self-heralding as the modern day abolitionists of modern day slavery. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that. I have a quick question, and then I just want to we're taking questions from the Q&A at the end. So anybody that wants to send a question, please do. I found your work incredibly interesting in the way that you trace these two parallel discourses and practices and the very disturbing ways that these myths, the modern day slavery, white slavery, and are used in tricky, I would say hypocritical ways. So I guess I want to just really curious to know if you've seen a counterattack. Have you seen folks from the pro-reparations tend to respond to this anti-trafficking, anti-Blackness discourse?
Thank you so much for that question, and again for engaging with the work. So have I seen people from like pro-reparations camps pushing this off? I mean, I think there's some sense, especially amid like racial justice activists, more widespread even than just reparations, that something is like amiss with human trafficking discourse, like there's something uncomfortable about it. And what I have seen is a lot of people, particularly who are working on prison abolition and who are working on decriminalizing sex work, really focus on how human trafficking, often criminalizes sex workers and holds up these prison as an important aspect in ending trafficking. So I've seen a lot of tension and like calling out, essentially like critique in that vein. Within reparations discourse, I haven't seen it as much, but one thing that I'm interested in thinking more about is how sometimes in talking about reparations, people will talk about the trafficking of Africans. And I'm quite curious to know if there's, which of course predates the discourse of contemporary human trafficking, right? Talking about trafficking in Africans comes from before 2000. But I do sometimes wonder, like, is that a way of pulling back some of the popularity of human trafficking and putting it into reparations? Does that make sense? Oh, I can't hear you.
Sorry, I muted myself because it cut you right when you were answering the most important point. Is there any way you can go back? I'm sorry. I think it's the storm. I wish we were in person.
That's okay. So the last point about reparations. Yeah, so I was just saying that I have seen some reparations advocates talk about like basically using the language of trafficking in calls for reparations, but from a perspective of like trafficking in Africans, which obviously predates the anti-trafficking discourse of the 2000s. And so I haven't, investigated that systematically, but every time I see it, I do kind of wonder, like, is this a way to get a little bit of that popularity for trafficking back onto reparations? So I do think there's this kind of constant interplay of the language. And you do increasingly see people kind of graft just some confusion about ways. That's okay. Thank you for the question.
I seriously hope we can continue discussing. We're going to move on to the next speaker, and then hopefully we'll have an interesting conversation altogether. So without further ado, Rosalind Armange. Thank you for being here.
Thank you everyone for being here. So for such a time like this, this presentation, racial terminology, positionality, and reparations in the Francophone Caribbean, come from my larger book project, Slavery Reparation in the Americas, an argument for racial terminology. So the whole argument of the book is connected to the relationships among racial colonial ideologies and the ongoing political avoidance of France regarding ethno-racial policies in widening the past of slavery. But in this chapter, I advocate for a new epistemic design of Blackness to engage a political return on the origins of the alias identity. But most importantly, I recall on a specific cultural identity to respond to the historical wrongdoings of colonial slavery and the slave trade under the alias identity. So by posing an authentic self-empowerment of the definition of Blackness in the Francophone Caribbean, we can see how the use of the ADOS signifier defies the black, white, and colonizer-colonized dialectic from which French imperial politics have had shaped the present days. And we can see how the ADOS signifier defies the socio-political and psychological issues on justified ideologies such as colorblindness, universalism, racism, and policies of ethno-racial avoidance. So history has shown us of the importance of historical data and narrative about slavery at plays in reproducing colonial ideologies, attitudes, and behaviors. So I will start with this citation of Joseph Sarimi-Lecaille, a Guadeloupean historian and lawyer at the Imperial Court of the West and the South of Haiti that prefaced Toussaint Louverture Memoir in 1853. So he said, quote, I would further believe that the difference in color, far from being an occasion for hatred between men, should be the cause of commendable and fraternal emulation. Finally, neither science, nor morals, nor logic can leave any doubt on the various aptitude of the Negro. To deny humanity for the Negroes would also be to deny it for the whites. End quote. This passage highlights how French knowledge production of the Negre reflect political discourse on race, morality, and social sciences. For the past 150 years, the Western colonial racial definition of the Negre has allowed French imperial politics to shape French ethno-raciality, structural justification, and related ideologies. So the word Negre here, or Negro in English, or Negre in French Creole, is a term used for the Black enslaved people in the French colonial empire. So this stigmata continues to perpetuate the contemporary denial of Black humanity and its heterogeneity. So this systematic dehumanization and permanent logic of disalienation tethered to colonial politics have enforced a global cultural, racial, and identitarian disappearance of the Black subject, a subject that is non-white, colonial, and from whom doctrinal policies leads to what Fanon called absolute depersonalization and decerebralization, end quote. In other terms, these historical legislative principles continue to pertain present days American inequality and violence among Black people of African descent origins. So I add that the disintegration of any form of Black subjectivity, thought, and knowledge finds contemporary prevalence in pervasive way of doing politics, such as assimilationist policies, reinforcement of blind-based ideologies, navigating between implicit racial threats and conspicuous racial violence. And these pervasive ways of doing politics foreshadow what Fanon calls, quote, the egocentric, sociocentric, and cultural-centric positioning of Westernity, end quote. So at a national and transnational level, the subsequent Black and indigenous new social movement arising in the late 80s in the Americas originates from addressing the after effect of modernity, a call for writing history and writing ethno-racial identities. More than a few new terms, a new racial terminology has arisen in the political realm, rendering visible a new identity politic that is the alias identity. In this wake of this racial turn, the Durban Conference marked a significant turn in reopening years of historical wounds, enjoying the Western European nations' responsibility regarding the historical and racial prejudices engendered by colonial slavery. So the Durban Conference also offered spaces to enact an international consensus using the lexicon ADOS to acknowledge and embrace the complexity of the identity of people of African descent origin. At term, more than 75 significant issues related to the various injustices experienced by ADOS population have been listed and viewed as of great importance to consider in the nation-state memorandum. Point number 22 of the Durban Declaration exposes the inadequacy of, quote, some state political and legal structure in addressing the multi-ethnic, pluricultural, and plurilingual characteristic of the population that is constitutive of racial discrimination, end quote. From a broader perspective, the alias identity is a local, national, and transnational identity from which the ADOS geo and political bodies vary along the complex spectrum of the Atlantic history of colonial slavery. To enjoin an Afro-decolonial approach, introducing an ADOS terminology in French legal culture is an attempt to find legitimate policies for the development of a non-white political subject. Drawing on the Afro-French philosopher Norman Ajari, it is, quote, a political coalition of all the Black and African descent particularities and singularities, end quote. France's political position regarding ethno-racial statistics has always been opposed to these international measures, aiming to prevent discriminations against people of different ethnic origin in order to preserve a national fiction of equal citizens. So drawing on the work of the historian Peabody and Savoy, discussing the ideology of race, Blackness, and its terminology in the Francophone Caribbean is, quote, both scholarly and political, as it was used first as a legal and practical category of discrimination, end quote. In 1998, Paris was burning silently during the march of more than 40,000 people of African descent origin from the Francophone Caribbean. Led by the March Committee of May 23, the reunion of several African descent associations, this silent march demonstrates the moral imperative of formally acknowledging in French national policies for slavery reparation. In 2001, the Taubira law broke the silences of the past by enacting the law recognizing slavery reparation and the slavery and the slave trade as a crime against humanity. So the expression of race, Caribbeanness, and Blackness during this march was entangled with what political scientist Jean-Yves Camus called the emergence of a Black political consciousness. The slogan "Nous sommes tous des filles et fils d'esclaves," we are all daughters and sons of slaves, underlies the ethno-racial dimensions of the ADOS identity in French political culture. More than a decade from our present day, this lexical appearance of the ADOS identity amid the silence of French politics revealed the importance, quote, in assessing the status of Black population regarding the lack of concrete data, to cite cultural historian David Briand-Davis, end quote. From slavery to the abolition in 1848 and the departmentalization of the French former colony in 1946 and the eradication of the word race from the French Constitution in 2018, the question of racial and colonial ideologies in contemporary politics is a process of revisiting the position of the ideal subject from a decolonized and new knowledge position. To draw on Nando Torres on the question of decolonial turn in psychology, it is a positionality that is moved by a collective psychological shift from the acceptance of inferiority and the condition of slavery to the assumption of the position of questioners, but also is an embodied being who seeks to become an agent of change, end quote. This decolonial inflection of thought, process, and knowledge production separates the past from the present and the future of critical reflection on raciality, ideologies, and implication in the case of reparation for slavery in the Francophone Caribbean. From this perspective, decoloniality contracts the sclerosis of political discourse and policies that have been into place since the process of decolonization. From a Francophone Caribbean perspective, it is a position that tends to rethink ideas in humanism, culture, subjectivity in new spaces that are contra-historical, contra-dominant, and contra-colonial. Rather than opposing Western thought and knowledge, drawing an episteme of the ideal subject in its geo-racial, identitarian, and body politics is a call of reckoning cultural, social, economic, and historical dignity into present days. So the idea is to render moral dignity to understanding what does it mean to be an ideal subject in a global or specific cultural context, and also what significance lies in shaping a new episteme of Blackness through the alias identity in national politics and international laws regarding the case for slavery reparation. So positioning the alias identity in the same baseline as Western normative perception of the subaltern culture give rise to new universal perspective of what I call an ethic of humanity. So drawing new discourse information of Blackness amidst Western epistemes overlaps with understanding how critical Westernity plays a role in shaping darker side, beliefs, attitudes, and behavior regarding people of African descent origins. Decolonizing Blackness creates new ways of dismantling modern forms of colonialism and capitalism. The integration of an ethno-racial identifier is a return to the puissance of signifiers that rise above the French universal subject and the Republican ideal of a national identity. And it is also a way to politically disengage with the racial frame of its capitalistic construction. The alias identity for the global movement for slavery reparation restates and assesses a new episteme of African descent knowledge, self, culture, and power. Decolonizing the alias identity from the Western mind, it is a global design, including a fundamental detachment from the Western contemporary form of ideologies. This detachment results from dislocating African descent culture from Western Western hegemony of knowledge, truth, and being. This adjunctive process engaged a self-decolonization method from the asymmetric relation of racial violence, social domination, and Black humanism, Western perception. Determining an operative term in African descent community leads to build an identity that remains cultural, historical, racial, and political. So the nexus of the historical prejudice of race created by the West proves to be discursive and ideological. It is, according to Stuart Hall, a production of knowledge through language. In this case, ideology reinforces the discourse by simplifying the cognitive processes of understanding knowledge in a binary manner of what is true and what is false, or legitimate or illegitimate. From this perspective, thinking about race, racial terminology, and Blackness in the Francophone Caribbean has never been quote, ideologically neutral or innocent, to cite Stuart Hall. To conclude, embracing the alias lexicon in legal culture in France is to go beyond the remaining fathomable dyadic relation of Black and white and colonizer relation to embrace a decolonial term that is a decoloniality of political ideologies of race, power, and relation between France and its old colonies, that is Martinique, Guadeloupe, Guyane Française, and Réunion. The politics of decoloniality in this case for slavery reparations aim to readdress Western European conservative ideology, which includes the maintenance of what is traditional and familiar and unequal form of social organizations, such as racial inequality, to quote John Jost, a political psychologist. Facing up to the past required to deconstruct and revisit the European-centric vision of the politics of thought, power, and truth concerning the notion of human rights, crime, and genocide. Entering the ADOS identity is a critical step to define the ethno-racial pluriversality of the ADOS identity in the French Caribbean and the Americas. More than a racial issue, focused on the racial phenotype, the ADOS positionality offers an ethno-racial subjective space, where Blackness is a conversion point of the many cultural expression of the ADOS living in the Americas. From those who culturally identify themselves as Neg Marron, to those who identify themselves as Métissos and descendants of the enslaved. So the ADOS positionality aims to bring the rhizomatic experiences of the many selves from which the transatlantic, the colonial, and the racial paradigms are part of the construction of the self that is unique in its geographical genre. The ADOS positionality responds to an inward cultural and political process. It is a call for an ethic of decolonial politics that incorporates a comprehensive investigation of human universality to see non-Western culture, truth and knowledge, impartially as significant as Western culture. So the ADOS identity extracts itself from the schizophrenic, assimilated, and pervasive subjective position imposed by the modern colonial world. The ADOS subject is a whole citizen of a democratic world embodied in a collective moment that rejects dominant, institutionalized, and racialized form of neoliberalism, universalism, and capitalism in the question of the repression for slavery. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that. How maybe you can talk to us more about how people in the French Caribbean relate to that, if who identifies with it, and what kinds of groups engage it, because as we know, its terminology is not necessarily been favorable to, I guess we could say, a transnational sort of reparations, social justice discourse, and other times it has. So I just wanted to know from you, since you elaborate on the ways that the racial subjugated, wonder where that's actually coming from, and if you've seen people discuss or put it forth as a political project or as some other kind of project. So I just wanted to put you a little on that. As I know, not all French Antillean, even pro-reparation activists necessarily use the term esclave or neg. It really depends. So if you maybe could speak to the Martinique case in particular, and then hopefully we can have a fuller discussion after, depending on how many questions we get. Thank you. Sorry, that was long.
Thank you for engaging with the work and your question. I'm gonna just reframe. The question of neg marron or neg is really something that Martinicans, they can call, use it in, culture, popular culture, music. However, on the question of the AUS terminology, this really question arises in the hand of the 19th, and that's framed. If people don't speak in the political space, in Martinique, for example, my research in 2016 shows that people are identified on this question in terms of identity. So it is really something that is new in terms of speaking about it on a political frame, but people really engage in the question of people engage on thinking about the question of using an alias identity to frame a broader perspective of the question of slavery reparation. So it is something that is currently going on, and this is what I'm working on. So I'm glad to hear more of your question and to also continue to gather more discussion on that.
I'm gonna, I had a couple of questions, so I think I'm just gonna go for it. And yeah, Laura, if you want to try and call in by phone, that would be great. Can you hear me now?
I can hear you. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, sorry. Yeah, go ahead. You since your questions are the first ones anyway, why don't you do that? And I'm going to try to move in the apartment to see if it works better.
Okay. Thank you so much to all the panelists for these great papers. I have a couple of questions. My first one's for Lindsey. I'm really interested in this, and I was kind of a couple of things. To what extent do you see this as the main humanitarian discourse that undermines reparations struggle? And to what extent do you see it as one of many others? Because there's so many ways I can think of in which, well, I don't know, I'll leave it at that, but like, I just wonder, it seems like your argument, and I wonder if your argument in a way maybe overestimates its importance in relation to other means of undermining reparations, or how do you see that? I'll ask that one, and then I'll ask my next.
Okay, thank you so much. Yeah, so that's a really important question. And I think I don't necessarily see it as like the main discourse that's undermining reparations. And in a lot of ways, that's not really my interest to like determine which one, or or all of the ones that do and to what extent. I think it's more that within anti-trafficking scholars, and even within people who are critical of these anti-trafficking narratives and policies, there hasn't really been any thinking, there hasn't been much thinking about it in relation to reparations. So for me, it's like, there's many things that undermine reparations all of the time, and I don't think that anti-trafficking is necessarily any more important than any other ones, including, structural anti-Blackness as like a main one. But I do think that it's important to think about this historical contingency, this moment where reparations organizing is getting traction in international sphere in the late 1990s. And it's the same moment when the US State Department invents the term modern day slavery and attaches it to, the figures that it's attached to kind of change over the years, but it starts with sex work and prostitution, then it becomes migration. First, it's like backward barbaric practices in Africa, and now it's a whole host of migration issues and economic development issues. And so I think that it's important to understand, in all of the critiques that people do have of anti-trafficking, why it doesn't work, why it misunderstands the problem, and that what hasn't really been fleshed out enough is how it specifically operates as a politically palatable alternative to reparations that still allows people to talk about slavery. And to that point, the further kind of scope of the book, of the argument, is that what it kind of creates is this figure of the historically innocent white subject, so which itself helps kind of undermine or dismiss demands for reparation. So it basically gives a lot of white people a way to call themselves modern day abolitionists without having to account for any of the actual histories of slavery and the legacies of slavery and the present circumstances that unfold therefrom. So it's not the argument is not aimed at like this is the most important one, but I do really appreciate you drawing that out, but rather how it kind of just the political convenience of the political agenda and the terminology that specifically are tied to it coming up at the same time.
It's really interesting. Thank you. Laura, are you back? Is it?
It looks like it's working now, I hope. I'm closer to the box, so it should. Thanks for being patient.
Do you have any more questions?
Do I? Well, I always have questions, but unfortunately, I mean, I didn't get to hear Rosalind's answer. So if you guys don't mind, I mean, I can even reformulate the question because I'm just, and I don't know how others feel. I've been out of the US for a while, so the ADOS kind of polemics and all of that, I wasn't really there at the moment, but I kind of followed. So I'm wondering what you guys maybe think also about terminology, as we've seen even with Lindsey's like using slavery in to define a people. Is that, I don't know, is that useful, and are French Antilleans really for that? My experience has been not everybody, and what's really interesting is often the people that are pro reparations are not necessarily the ones that want to embrace the identity as being necessarily that of the slave. In fact, a lot of that work of self-repair comes from changing the terms. It's no longer. So I wonder, in Martinique, in your experience, and I didn't get to hear your answer, so maybe I'm talking past you, and unfortunately, and that's unfortunate. But if you could just talk a little bit more about, in Martinique, who's engaging in the discussion of ADOS, what terms are they using, and who of those is also engaging reparations, and how?
So thank you. I'm gonna rewrite. This is the question of the ADOS in Martinique really emerged when I did my first study between 2010 and 2015. So we use the ADOS to assess how people perceive national policy for reparation for slavery. So people will self-identify themselves to the questionnaire, to the question, because we ask them, okay, if you want to respond about it, do you self-identify? And most of the people who respond, use that self-identification. So it is not about affirming the question of slavery on this generative term. It is more to open and define different ways of thinking about Blackness and thinking about the question of slavery, but to use it as a political ways to engage on the question of slavery reparation on the political spectrum, you see? So it is not more than to have an identity that is rooted in this question only, or the victimhood mentality. It is more to open new ways of redefining Blackness, because the question of Blackness has always been defined in the Western perspective. But in my book project, I define it in the new ways that embrace this heterogeneity that can be found in America, in the US, or in the Caribbean, but it is a political subject. It's allowing us to engage on a transnational level on the question of reparation policies. So, and as I'm defining this question, I'm also designing the question of, okay, so how do you call yourself? Why do you call yourself like that? And why this is specific? Because in the Francophone Caribbean, there is a question of thinking about the geographical space, thinking about the question of rhizomatic questions, because we are coming from a lot of spaces, and also thinking, using the transatlantic slavery paradigms as a tool, and also using the question of the decolonialism, the decolonial subject, to embody the question of, okay, this is a new body, a new political body. It is not a way of unframing the question of, oh, we were a slave and we are defined and confined in space. So it is new also. It also challenges what the ideas frame in the US, but I'm questioning this thing to bring it to the Caribbean extensively. I hope so, because it's depending of the each histories bring its specificities, and to redress reparation, we have to also assess policies, because in Peru they also assess that kind of policies, and Argentina. So there is policies to also see how many people are discriminated, are victim of discrimination. So it's also to, okay, how can we see in the population people who are in need of what the CARICOM plan, CARICOM 10-point plans explain, to have psychological rehabilitation, health education, health, and to fight against that, in fact. So I'm just using this ideas lexicon to readdress the needs of assessing from proper policies to assess the social inequality and the racial inequality.
Thanks. I wonder if I could ask another question. Is that okay with everyone? Just because at the beginning you said you asked folks how they identify. So could you just give us the context of what kind of study, your methods? Just basically, like, was it a survey or did you do field? I mean, what kind of?
Yes,
a survey. Okay.
Yes, it was a quantitative survey. So that was also the frame of the research. So yeah, so far we want to extend with my other folks the research in the metropolitan France to see how this lexicon is useful, maybe to be introduced in national policies, such as the policies that have been implemented recently in the Latin America's country. Yeah. So
who you said you speak of we did the study, so was it with a group? I'm just wondering how people responded, because that, for me, it's really interesting to know what were their choices too in identifying, for example.
Can you clarify, please? The we?
Sorry, yeah. No, I'm just curious. You said you spoke of we, so I just wanted to know, was it a collective project that you led, or, and also what were the choices for the people who identified as ABUists or as something else? I'm not sure
when I speak about we in social sciences, I speak with me and my advisor. We conduct this research. Yeah.
Okay.
So just to specify the we.
Yeah. Okay. But yeah, and the terms, sorry, one more thing. The terms that were in your survey, just to know how, I mean, what were their choices? What exact terms did you use? Even if it's the French week and then.
Laura, I'm going to intervene here because we don't have that much longer, and we have another question from.
Okay.
Sorry, Rosaline, to interrupt this, but we'll come back to this. If it's okay, we can come back to your final question in a second, Laura. But I just want to ask this because
Sure.
I'm in from Anna,
Yes.
and it's for Krisa, and it says, "Thank you for an amazing presentation. I'm curious to learn about whether you have come across the question of repatriation as reparations as a twofold sword. From what I understand, returning these artifacts is framed as reparations. Are you familiar with claims to redress for the century-long harms that colonial looting has caused?" So the question is kind of about whether there's also claims for the harm that the loss of this cultural property caused beyond the artifacts being returned themselves.
Yeah, that's a really good question. Thank you for asking. I do think that, I think that there is, so last year in 2020, the EU Parliament put forward a kind of a package bill, which was, it was essentially, it was a package bill in reparations, which proposed, there were about, 27, I think, different articles on various kinds of reparations, which ranged from, addressing issues of discrimination, such as, housing, employment, other like kind of socioeconomic of, socioeconomic kind of disadvantage that people of color, particularly Black people, in the EU experience, and ways kind of like social protective measures to address those. So that was kind of one form of the reparations that they addressed. Of the 27 articles within this bill, there was only one that directly mentioned particularly like cultural artifact reparations, or the repatriation of cultural artifacts as a form of reparation. So there is, I think, starting to be language around like kind of broader reparations, and as a subset of that, the restitution or repatriation of cultural artifacts. But oftentimes those are not addressed, coterminously. I would say that, it's interesting because the EU Parliament doesn't actually have a lot of power to enforce this. So essentially this bill was a recommendation to EU member states to, adopt legislation to address issues of discrimination. A lot of it was also symbolic too. So in addition to discrimination, there was also a sense that, the EU Parliament was urging governments, like member states, to have national days of reckoning and remembering for, African descendants of slavery, or, service days, like, or remembrance days for people who are descendants of slavery. And so there's a sense that there's a lot of symbolic meaning behind these actions. And there is attempt to redress some of the discrimination that people of color experience in member states. But really, the focus on the restitution of these artifacts is pretty minimal within the framework of larger reparations. But, hopefully that's something that, that is something that individual states, like I mentioned, Germany, some smaller museums in the UK, particularly the one in London, the Hardeman Museum that I mentioned. Dutch and Belgian governments are also being pretty progressive, the French as well. I'd say the UK is probably the least progressive. They're just a little bit slower. But, as member states go, I think each country is handling this at their own pace. But it's a bit more difficult at the EU level to really focus on, but that is starting to be part of the conversation. Thanks for that question.
Does anyone else have questions, panelists or
I have a question for Krisa. Krista, just following on that, just wondering, what are some of the reasons that member states give for the difficulties in returning the artifacts?
That's a great question, and that's like, that's really the entire dissertation is trying to understand and grapple with that. So a lot of it, I mean, it depends on the nation. So for the UK, which has the vast, no one really knows how many artifacts were looted because a lot of them were destroyed during the 1897 invasion, but there's an estimate from anywhere between 3,000 and 10,000 artifacts that still remain that are outside of the Benin Kingdom. And the British Museum holds the largest collection of them, so they have about 900 of them. And essentially in 1753 and again in 1963, there was an act of parliament passed, which essentially said that the British Museum it's called the British Museum Act of 1753 and of 1963, that the British Museum cannot deaccession, which means giving away these artifacts. So it would literally require a change of law, like an amendment to this parliamentary act in order for them to be able to give it back. So that's kind of what they hide behind. They say, we would love to give it back, but we're just, our hands are tied. The law says that we can't do it. But there's been a lot of precedent for there being amendments to these acts before. And so one of the things that, generations of activists in the UK have done is tried to lobby various MPs and city councillors to change this particular act. So there's a legal argument for not being able to return it. I would say the biggest argument, though, actually is the sense that the artifacts just won't be safe. There's a belief that, there's a belief that, which is like, I spoke a little bit to this, just the sense of irony that, these particularly these Benin artifacts were produced in the 13th century. And they were totally fine, in Africa from the 1200s to, 1897 when they were looted. But for some reason now there's a sense in the Western, kind of art preservationist community that if these artifacts returned, they would either be returned to unsafe conditions or kind of, related to your actual, your paper, that, there are a lot of thieves there. They're like looters and pillagers and like, these people in Africa can't be trusted with their own artifacts because they're just going to steal them and put them on the black market. Then we need to protect them from their own thieves. And so there's a sense that, the European museums are actually the proper guardians in terms of giving them the right conditions to be housed in the museums and also protecting them from being stolen. The irony of that, obviously, is that, these are stolen artifacts that we're talking about. And then the other one is more, kind of an intellectual argument about the role of the Western Museum, the Universal Museum. And so a lot of these museums, so in 2000, I think 2 or 2003, there was a kind of a declaration of the importance of the Universal Museum. So it was signed by about 16 Western museums kind of in the North Atlantic. And they basically said that, they were under a lot of pressure to return their artifacts. And, essentially the statement just said, we are really important because we're the only ones that can tell the story of human history in our museums. Like if we send these artifacts back, that's nationalistic, it's only going to be seen by people from those countries. And there's merit in being able to tell a global story, and only these universal European kind of North Atlantic museums are able to do that. And so there's kind of an intellectual argument. And the final argument I would say is even kind of more absurd to me, which is, well, a lot of these museums argued that because they were involved in these colonial expeditions, this is part of their heritage too. This is part of their colonial history. So the former director of the British Museum, Neil McGregor, was gone on record saying, the Benin bronzes are part of British history because we were the ones who invaded Britain and brought them back. Therefore, this is our history. So we are just as much entitled to owning this history of the Benin bronzes as the Benin people are. So those are just a few of the arguments that are made to hold on to them.
Thank you. That's so fascinating. I had a suspicion about the caretaking one, so thank you.
I have a question for you, Krista. The same, but in the French context, because we're speaking about the K1, and I know the question is also sensitive about who are responsible, and you put something on the question of the the intellectual frame on who are responsible, who, and of honing on reclaiming something that is used to be from the Benin population. So I wonder how it is in France.
Sorry, Rosalie, is the question, what is the France perspective on restitution currently?
Yes, and how they see these things, and if the intellectual people think the same in the British.
I see, okay. Yeah, that's a great question. Actually, the French have been much more, so actually it was Macron who reignited this public debate. So he went to, he gave a speech, I want to say in 2016 or 2017 in the country Benin, and essentially, said that, I think he was trying to kind of re-establish diplomatic relations with Benin. And he said, it's really unfair that we have your objects. We have 26 in the Quai Branly that we would like to return. And so then that, and he said, and I'm also going to commission a report to understand where all of the other artifacts in the Quai Branly came from, how they arrived in our museum, and what it may take to give them back. And so he commissioned this report, which was published in 2018. It's called the Savoy report. And it essentially sent shockwaves throughout the European and US museum community, because it essentially said that this is that statistic that I quoted at the very end of my presentation, which was that's an estimated 90% of Africa's cultural heritage is held outside of the continent. That comes from this report. And so essentially, through their 2 years of research, found that, that this is not just an isolated problem to even just like the colonial countries that like responsible for the invasions. Like once these objects were removed, say from like, Benin, they were circulated around the globe. So even here at Harvard, we have one of the Benin bronzes here in our art museum. There's another, there's a few dozen in the Museum of Fine Arts just across the river in Boston. So they've kind of been like globally circulated. So they're not just like still in the UK or still in France. And so the argument was essentially that every single museum in the world, and there are about 160 of them that have Benin bronzes, need to start evaluating their collections and understand how they arrived at the museum, and open up this kind of transparent process whereby countries that know that their artifacts that were looted are in these museums can start the process of asking for them back. And of course, that when that report was released in 2018, commissioned by Macron, it upset the entire museum community, because they're like, oh my God, our museums are now going to be empty. What are we going to do? Which, if that's your response, then that's also an admission of guilt that you think everything in your museum has been stolen. And so there needs to be some kind of reckoning with that. But so I would say that actually France has been on the front line of leading these conversations. It's a very slow process, because, it's one thing to say, get a museum. It's a huge deal to get a museum to say that they're willing to return an object. But then when, if they get to the point where they agree to do that, the question is then, who are they returning it to? The communities have, necessarily changed, obviously, since, 1897. So, who's in leadership now? Who's going to receive them back? So those are the kinds of questions that they're contending with. But France has actually been, I'd say, much more progressive on this issue than the UK, and definitely on par with other states like Denmark and Belgium. Thanks for that question.
I think we got another question from the chat. Finally, it's working again for me, so I'm going to read it. It is from Zaira Simone, who's another panelist, in another session. It's for Rosaline. She asks, do you think BLM has shifted the reparations discourse in Martinique?
Okay, this is my personal perspective for what also I see recently happening in Martinique, since the racial pandemic last year. There is definitely a revival of the new generation, the young generation, on the question of reparation for slavery, and the Black Lives Matter. Really, it's the transnationality of the Black Lives Matter is really transcending everything around the world. So, and there was an African personality who came in Martinique last year, reclaiming this question and reassessing this question. So Martinicans in Martinique are really aware of the question and want to reopen this case. And what's happened too is there was a lot of in the UK, in the US, and in the old colonies, that is Martinique, rebellion a little bit, but also the artifacts that was in the cities, so they were destroying them. So I definitely think that there is much more to do on this question, and also because the Black Lives Matter assessed the fundamental question of social justice and racial justice. And underneath is there is policies to being implemented to help, make a difference on that. So I guess, and I hope so, that in the French case, ethno-raciality, there is no ethno statistic. It's prohibited. So I hope that the discourse can shift, because there is recent report on the question of discrimination and racism that is increasing since last year in France, but nobody wants to assess really what it is and to implement concrete policies to see what is the disparities in France and in the French Caribbean, because there is a gap also in the socioeconomic level of these different spaces, geographical spaces. So definitely. So yeah, I think this is a talk that I hope so will continue to be global.
Krista, do you want to ask your question?
Sure, I can. So I don't know if this is correct, but I feel like at one point I remember hearing that the US for like a number of years didn't include an evaluation of itself in the Trafficking in Persons report. And that just, kind of screams to me the sense of American exceptionalism, that like we can evaluate other countries, but not what's going on within our own borders. And so I'm wondering, to what extent do you feel like American exceptionalism has a role to play in this kind of lack of accountability for slavery that the US is exhibiting?
It has every role to play. Thank you so much for that question. Yeah, you're absolutely correct. The first couple of years, I don't remember when it switches, but first couple of years, there's no report about US cases. And then an interesting thing happens, which is the situation of migrant guest workers, primarily farm workers in the US, gets kind of looped in as this example of modern day slavery in the US. So that then becomes the example that the TIP report uses to self-indict. And so they come up with a very small number of exploited people in the US. And it's interesting that it becomes the case of migrant guest worker farm workers, because those people are actually on state-sanctioned limited guest worker visas. So to the extent that migrant farm workers are exploited, it's because that's how the program is designed by the US government. Now, the US government holds up some extreme cases of and there is a lot of exploitation that happens. I'm not trying to argue there isn't, but the government holds up some extreme cases of exploitation within that system as slavery in the US, and says, now we're turning an eye on ourselves. But what that also does is feeds back onto itself, becomes an alibi again for the state, the US state, to not be complicit in, or not even complicit, like the architects of, right, these vulnerable making programs. So it was, Yeah, definitely US exceptionalism. That's also what I'm kind of getting at with the idea of slavery within Africa. I mean, the primary areas that people talk about human trafficking within this anti-trafficking apparatus is like brick making in India, Ghanaian children in fishing communities. There's like specific types of exploitation that get held up as the prime examples of what constitutes for this apparatus modern day slavery. And those are supported by, you know, those come to be through NGOs that work in those areas that like have these images and reports about exploitation. But what it does is really limit what we imagine contemporary exploitation to be, to a particular set of cases that could then be potentially solved as through, you know, essentially criminalization or through like NGO-based rehabilitation programs or something that they never address the root issues of what creates kind of like unsafe migration and uneven life chances throughout the world and throughout the US. But interestingly, like you have, of course, in the US, you also have a discourse around prison abolition. So people who want to get rid of prisons and sometimes use the phrase modern day slavery to describe the conditions within prison. But that type of modern day slavery is never in the TIP reports. So, you know, there's a whole conversation also there about, is slavery the best frame for what's happening in US prisons? But whether it is or isn't, it's never included by the State Department. So it's completely a tool for the state to determine what counts as legitimate exploitation and injustices in ways that always exculpates itself, even when it appears to be implicating itself, when it adds the dimension of, you know, so-called modern slaves in the US. Thank you for your question. Yeah.
Just very briefly, because I've seen a lot of this in the UK as well. Like Theresa May was obsessed with human trafficking and sex trafficking, especially like with this figure of the innocent Eastern European girl at the same time as like Brexit is it was just a very strange moment. And I just wonder, are the US and the UK the like central hubs for these discourses, and maybe Canada, or is this, do you know if like France, Germany, Denmark are also, because I just know from what I've seen, the UK is probably I've also seen so many plays in London that are like about sex trafficking, like this figure is just everywhere.
Yes. Yeah, thank you. Oh, go ahead.
Yeah, no, that's it. Sorry.
Yeah, so I focus on the US and I think about how US policy and US specific like racial categories and histories get taken up through this transnational governance, which become, you know, anti-trafficking policy is now transnational, but it very much imports a lot of US kind of thinking about what slavery means and what it looks like, what it used to look like and all that. But the UK is just as, you know, many people only focus on the UK, and it has as much, probably more than the US, particularly because it passed the Modern Slavery Act back in, I think, 2014.
That's what I was thinking of.
Yes, and so once they passed the Modern Slavery Act, it was like there was so much news articles and the language of modern slavery. So in the US, it's modern day slavery. In the UK, it's modern slavery. I mean, as a rhetorician, who knows, but so modern slavery, because it was in the act, in the legislation, it then becomes so prominent in the news coverage, becomes synonymous with any type of sex work. It's used to promote border control. So one of the problems with human trafficking policies that are trying to end human trafficking is they tend to be very, they uphold the status quo. So they often are used, it's like a humanitarian issue that's used to enforce border patrol, to like add more protectionist thinking around borders, to criminalize people, to build up a carceral apparatus, and then to kind of repeat these stereotypical narratives of white saviors, like things like that. So I think, you know, under the guise of modern slavery, the UK has been able to kind of push for, you know, border criminalization. And that's also, you know, there's a story within people who study the history of how anti-trafficking laws come to be. A lot of feminists in the early days focused on the fact that there was like this unlikely bedfellows of like Republican in the US, Republicans and Democrats coming together under the guise of like women's rights. But it was always really fraught because there was a strong evangelical contingent that was just interested in abolishing all sex work. So it's like it's just, the point I'm trying to make is just that the anti-trafficking from the beginning in the 2000s, a moment of it has just always had a lot of like Republican and socially conservative interests built into the language, which is why you get a lot of solutions that don't solve any of the root problems that cause the migration and economic exploitation issues.
Thank you. I have a question. If we're going to conclude, then I'll take the time to ask another question.
Okay, great.
I was wondering why now with some of this stuff, especially with Creasa's work, like I've seeing how much is happening in Europe at the moment, like the Savoy report, and I wonder, I'd be interested. I mean, I guess you could all answer that question to a degree in terms of, I mean, we know the like Black Lives Matter aren't like the last summer and that the way that catalyzed things, but I think there's a wider question of like why now, why, like when we started doing this conference, it wasn't as much of a thing. And I mean, of course it was amongst Black folks and amongst people, but like on a wider level, like why now? Why are like European countries so much more invested now in this, for instance, than they were 3 years ago, at least when it comes to Creasa's work? But all of you maybe could potentially answer. I don't know the answer, so it's like a massive question, but like, yeah.
I also don't know the answer, but, and I wonder this all the time myself, but I do think that, you know, at least in terms of, you know, cultural artifact restitution, this seems to be an issue that comes up every 2 decades or so. There's like a mass mobilization around it. So there was a big one in the 70s, kind of in the like post-colonial, like, you know, like immediate post-colonial period in Africa, when a lot of like Pan-Africanist conferences were happening in the 70s. There was another big one in the 90s when UNESCO started putting forward some legislation to, you know, kind of retroactively, you know, so this is something that comes up, and actually Benedict Savoy, one of the authors of the report you just mentioned, one of the things that she often says is, you know, this isn't new. You know, this is something activists have been calling for, the return of these objects for years. It's kind of cyclical when governments start to listen and start to respond. And so that's kind of what, so like activists are like constantly putting pressure on governments, but it's only really governments that start responding, you know, when they want to. And so I think right now, I mean, there's such mass pressure, I think, you know, I think that in response to Rosalie's question about what is France doing. And I, mentioned Macron making that speech, and I think it was 2016, 2017. I think it really only takes one, it's like a really small act that then has this domino effect. So he made this small speech to like a small diplomatic party, but basically said, we have these 26 artifacts and we've been wanting to give them back to Benin. And then all of a sudden, this report is released, and then like all of a sudden like the UK is like, oh my God, we should release a report, and then Germany is like, oh, we're going to update our guidelines. And so it really just had this kind of domino effect. And then I think activists really capitalized on this moment and saw openings and really started to push their governments. Like, I know that I personally have been kind of swept up in it. And, once the there was a huge story last summer at the height of the George Floyd protests, when someone actually stole or tried to steal some of the artifacts from the Cape Brunley Museum. And so I got swept up in that. And I didn't try to steal an artifact, but I approached the Harvard Art Museum about their objects. And so I think it just becomes really contagious. And this just seems like a really big moment globally for, demands for reparations. And so I think that it just so happens that a lot of people are capitalizing at this time.
To continue on your answer, that's for me, it's like, as you said, each decade bring a new push, they push the boundaries, and this is what happened, because if you look at the history at the end of colonialism, that was also this big effect of, in the Caribbean having the independencies, in each, British island, in France also there was like a play on it. And after that, in the Durban conference, reassessing the question of addressing the issues of racial discrimination, also bring back this global mobilization. And now the death of George Floyd also bring this massive effect of bringing a revival of it. But it has always been there. So activists and people in the community always, push, but the global make it, in a bigger effect. So, and more maybe give more proactiveness on the nation states. And I hope so that it might continue like that, because it's a question of pushing the boundaries to the question of, collective repair and what we mean about reparation in the global area. Yeah.
Yeah, I would also just say that I always think about the cyclical nature. Like at one point when I started grad school, the idea was like, you can't do a project on reparations because reparations is like had its moment in like the early 2000s. And so now here I am, just a little past dissertation, and it's like, but I just agree about the cyclical nature. Like we've seen within US history, we've seen so many moments of Pan-African organizing and calls for reparations, and they kind of, are cyclical. I like how you put it about the governments. Thank you.
Yes, and also to add, it is also about the question of fairness and the question of dignity of, what has been stolen. I think about you and the question of the artifacts, and also about the dignity of what is humanism, what is Black humanism, and how we view people like that, and in terms of social, economic and political, ways, and because there is still big gaps in terms of racial inequality, health disparities, social inequality. So it's really about the question of fairness, how we address this ethical question of this nation state, about seeing, facing up the past. In fact, facing up the past.
I think we are out of time now, right? So there we do have to stop. Thank you so much for this great panel. It was really interesting. I definitely learned a lot. And we will see everyone on Monday for the next panel, which is called Ecologies of Repair. Alyssa James is the discussant, and that's with Natasha Mortley, Andrea Baldwin, and Laura Binney Carter, who was here today. And that will be Monday, 1 to 3 p.m.
I'm still here, and thank you very much, you guys. All the papers were very interesting, and this discussion was great.
Great, thanks so
We
much.
can
Lara.
continue and keep it up. Keep the discussion going.
See you
Bye.
on Monday, hopefully.